Good evening, everybody. I'm going to just give this a few moments for people to come into the room, and then I'll get started. This is our fifth One Health seminar of the fall semester, and this is our seventh year of doing One Health seminars here at Delaware Valley University. I am so happy that you're joining us this evening. For those of you who have not been to a One Health seminar before, let me tell you a little bit about One Health. So from our point of view at Delaware Valley University, One Health is pretty darn simple, and it certainly mimics what those of us who work in wildlife management have known for a very long time. We're all on one planet, and the interactions between people, animals, and environment are two-way streets, that we can have good or bad influences on each other. And decisions really need to be looked at from a transdisciplinary approach. I think that probably our guest speaker tonight will mimic the fact that, we can approach problems from a biological point of view, but if we don't include the humans and we don't look at the habitat itself, we're missing the boat here. So One Health is this transdisciplinary approach, and it can look at problems from our regional level all the way up to the global level, and just encourage us to cross hands of cross disciplines and to take advantage of what knowledge and experiences others have to address these problems, and also for us to think in a more global way, to think about our connectedness with the natural world and where it goes from there. And at Del Val, we approach this from three different points of view. One is education. And so courses, we start right out with one of our freshman experiences talking about One Health and in trying to encourage students to attend seminars like this one. I included in all of my classes. I teach wildlife management, I teach wildlife conservation, mammalogy, climate change, and certainly all of those, as far as I'm concerned, are One Health topics. And in fact, I think that economics is a One Health topic. Criminal justice is a One Health topic, and we need to approach it from these transdisciplinary approaches. We need to encourage research that approaches problems from a transdisciplinary approach. And then the other leg of our little stool here, our three-legged stool, is outreach. And our seminar series is part of that outreach. The other part of it that we've been doing for the last several years is this week, we're celebrating One Health Week at Delaware Valley's University. And so that's included an outbreak traveling exhibit from the Smithsonian's Natural History Museum that's on display in the Life Sciences building. It includes, today we had a milkshake truck. And so 500 milkshakes were given out, and you had the opportunity to make a pledge for changing something in your life for the better of the world. We've got competitions, several different competitions, and you probably all heard about them from me several times already, but hopefully you'll take participation in those and taking advantage of them. This weekend on Saturday, we'll be doing a mock disease outbreak. USDA will be out to work with us, and we will have some faux disease that could potentially become a major problem, not only for the university, but for our community, maybe our state, maybe the entire country. And so this sounds kind of familiar, doesn't it? Like something we may be in the midst of right now. And for wildlife people, it's been predicted for a very long time that this was going to be an issue. So hopefully you will participate in this. At this point, I'm going to try and stop sharing. If my screen will show me where the stop share button is. Let me see here. Come on, share button. There. Okay, I finally got out. Okay. At this point, I would like to introduce our speaker this evening. And this is a person who I have known for a lot of years. A lot of years. And I am horrified to say that I have not had the opportunity to work with her a lot in recent years, but I am so happy to have her here tonight. I'm going to read from the flyer on this, but I hope you'll recognize that there's a lot of passion involved in this. I am very, very pleased to see Dr. Bennett with us this evening. So, Dr. Bennett, Elizabeth Bennett, is Vice President for Species Conservation at the Wildlife Conservation Society, WCS. For many of you, you may think of it as being the Bronx Zoo, but it's much bigger than that. Global conservation efforts. She received her Ph.D. from Cambridge University, and you may notice from her accent that she's not from New York City. She was working on the ecology of primates in peninsular Malaysia and actually lived in Sarawak from 1984 until 2002, and was the first ever to really do some detailed work with one of my favorite primates, proboscis monkey. And also got involved with looking at the effects of hunting and logging on wildlife. And so again, looking at multi-sectors here, working against, in this case, particular primates. She then led a team with WCS and the Sarawak government to write a comprehensive wildlife policy for the state, and subsequently to head a unit within the government that overseed the implementation of that plan. That's so nice. You know, you get a plan written and then it just sits there. It's nice to actually have some impact on making sure it gets done too. She became director working of the Hunting and Wildlife Trade Program at WCS. And this included working with WCS field people to develop strategies to address bushmeat trade in Central Africa and illegal wildlife trade in China. And our history goes back to a group called the Bushmeat Crisis Task Force many years ago, which we were still working on this problem that remains still a threat today too. Her current role overseeing WCS's species conservation programs on a global level. She has more than 130 both scientific and popular publications. And her work is not only recognized by many of her peers as being outstanding and a person that we all like working with, but it's also been recognized on more of a global level. She's been awarded the Golden Ark, and that was by the Prince Bernhard of the Netherlands. The MBE was awarded to her by Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II. And the Merdeka Award for outstanding contributions to the people of Malaysia. I can't think of anything more than having this kind of global recognition during your career, as well as the satisfaction of doing some incredibly important work. I am so happy to welcome Dr. Elizabeth Bennett. It is all yours.
Thank you very much indeed, Dr. Hoyt. I will share my screen if I can. There we go. Yes, doing this with my best New York Bronx accent, as you pointed out. So I'm going to be talking about wildlife trafficking, and that it's what a threat it is to the health of species, the health of ecosystems, and the health of humans. As you just heard, this is really a transdisciplinary topic, and it needs transdisciplinary solutions to it. So until recently, wildlife crime per se wasn't really considered to be a major area of conservation focus. We thought that if we studied wild species and their needs in the wild, whether we're talking about primates or carnivores or whatever else, and we use that information where they are to protect their habitats. This is the latest map of protected areas and other area-based conservation measures areas of the world, which there's a lot. So we thought if we did that and protected the areas which are most important for wildlife, and then reduce the threats within those protected areas, including the threat of hunting, such as this guy here who's just shot this tiger. And we work with the local communities to ensure their support, which is really critical. As Red said, we can't do this without people. And if we did all that, then we'd be protecting the wild species and the wild places we care about, such as here in Zanzibar in Southern Central African Republic. But no, Even when we were doing all this, we were losing some of the most charismatic species on the planet. In the past 20 years, 4 subspecies of rhinos have gone extinct. 30 years ago, Sumatran rhinos, which are the smallest rhino, they're these wonderful woolly ones with an extraordinary sort of whistling call. They were throughout the forests of Malaysia and Thailand, but they're not anymore. They've gone from there. There may be less than 50 left in the whole world, restricted largely just to Sumatra in Indonesia. There's these huge cattle which used to be all across Asia. This is the banteng, and there's another slightly smaller one. Sorry, this is the gaur, another slightly smaller one called the banteng. This guy's huge. He's about 7 foot high at the shoulder, but their populations are winking out across Asia where they occur as well. In terms of wild tigers, here we are in the year of the tiger. There's been a recent reassessment. The numbers are actually going up very slightly, although it's probably partly because we're getting better at counting them, but there's still only about 4,500 wild tigers remaining, which is kind of nothing. And the species is both endangered and under IUCN's new green status classification, which looks at how close things are to being fully recovered. So the red list looks at how close it is to becoming extinct. The green status looks at how far it is from being fully recovered, and it's critically depleted. It's still been lost over the majority of its historical range. Now, these ones aren't due to loss of habitat. About 70%, I mean, loss of habitat's historically been a problem, a huge problem, but at the moment now, about 70% of wild tigers are found in just 6% of the remaining habitat. So there's quite a lot of tiger habitat left, which has no tigers left in it. This study showed that over a 10-year period here, we lost nearly 2/3 of Africa's forest elephants, which is absolutely staggering. Now there's maybe only about 80,000 left across the whole of Central Africa. But again, this is not due entirely to loss of forest. The area of remaining forest should allow more than 10 times that to survive. So what's happening to these species? It's largely hunting for trade, for highly valuable body parts, and increasingly for some taxa like songbirds and tortoises and turtles, the pet trade. It's run by organized criminal syndicates. It's driven to, not entirely, but to quite an extent, by high prices in East Asia. So we're looking here at going from left to right along the bottom here. This is an ivory shipment, rhino horn, tiger bones, saiga horns, pangolins, which I'll talk more about in a minute, and tortoises and turtles in a market in Guangzhou in China. Now, this is not hunting by rural people for their own use or for local sales. That can be sustainable. It's often not, but it can be if it's well managed, and it's often essential to supporting their livelihoods. So that's not what I'm talking about here. What I'm talking about is trade that's illegal and international. And it's much more sophisticated than the occasional stories that we read about in the news and sort of slightly snigger over as some guy that's caught with a bunch of birds trapped to his socks as he comes through Florida customs. This is on industrial scales. These are bear paws on the left here in Asia. Here is our pangolins again. This was part of a shipment of 23 tons of frozen pangolins that were confiscated on their way from Indonesia up to Vietnam. So it's on a huge scale. And it's organized crime with networks of criminals and linked to other forms of organized crime, such as drugs, guns. And so just to show you some of what I'm talking about here, here's an X-ray of a truck that was taken going through customs in Hong Kong. This is at the top here was the truck as a whole, and the X-ray picked up that there was something odd here at the far end of the truck as you load it. And so they opened it up, and that was what was inside it. So again, highly organized, huge scale. That's an awful lot of elephants. The entire trade is facilitated by corruption from source to consumer. So if you think a lot of this stuff is coming up from Africa and Southeast Asia into some of these countries in East Asia here, the whole trade generally goes from south to north. This is the Transparency International's Global Corruption Index. A lot of these are pretty corrupt countries. And so That means that bribery comes at all levels, from somebody bribing a ranger to ignore the fact that they're hunting without a permit, to bribing customs officers to let the shipment through, to bribing officers in markets at the other end. This was just one example that was picked up on the Vietnam-China border by my colleagues a few years ago now. This river here marks the Vietnam-China border, China to the north, Vietnam to the south. There's only one legal border crossing point. It's that one here, number 9. That's actually a bridge. And you have to go through and declare everything. But all these other numbers are illegal crossing points, which have something like 10 times the trade of the legal border crossing point. And that's what these look like, with just little boats going across all the time. And they were, on any one day, bribes were being paid. It was just like a tax to go across, of up to $30,000 a day. So that's kind of how the trade is working. So we've got a problem, and this affects a huge number of species. We think of things like elephants and tigers, but it also affects a vast number of other species, such as tortoises, turtles, rhinos, saiga, pangolins, songbirds. It's really huge. So why does it matter? Why does it matter if this trade is going on? Why should we care, sitting over here in the States, that this is going on? Well, first, these species have intrinsic value, which the world recognizes. The belief that we should not allow species to go extinct. It's the basis of the Endangered Species Act in this country, of the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, which is an international convention with now 184 signatory countries. So basically every country pretty much is a member. I'm going to talk about that a little more in a moment. And the IUCN Red List of Threatened Species, they're all based on the basically ethical principle that we shouldn't allow other species to go extinct. Then cultural values. A lot of these species that are being hunted are iconic, and they have very strong cultural values going back often centuries within the cultures and countries where they occur. Species are important for jobs and economies. Now, these data were pre-COVID, because of course COVID has caused tourism to collapse in the meantime. But before that, in these 2 East African countries, most of the tourism is wildlife based, and it was worth a very significant proportion of the GDPs, employing several thousand people in each country. Now, since then, clearly COVID disrupted that. Tourism is starting to come back, and so hopefully that'll pick up again. Most importantly, and a lot of this gets to the transdisciplinary stuff, species are really critical to the functioning of ecosystems, whether we're talking about browsers and sort of ecosystem engineers, such as our elephants here, big frugivores in the forest, such as gibbons and hornbills, to large carnivores. Many species that are being lost over much of their range because of overhunting are keystone species or ecological engineers, and their loss has cascading effects on many other species. So we're not just losing them, we're losing the plants and animals that they interact with as well. Now, this one isn't so much necessarily illegal international trade. This is much more local within country trade, but loss of wildlife to urban trade really does harm local communities, a lot of whom depend on it for their own nutrition. And wild meat is still a major source of protein and income to at least 154 million households across the tropics and subtropics. And these are generally the most marginalized people who have very little other alternatives, apart perhaps from wild fish, of protein. And so if that meat is taken out of there, hunted and taken out to urban centers, then these people are pushed even further against the wall. More recently, we're clearly becoming aware that species are critical to mitigating climate change. And the forests, we're all aware of the forests. Tropical forests store about 55% of carbon globally. And highly intact forests, those ones really away from roads, away from much anthropogenic influence, big forests, they have carbon dioxide in their vegetation equivalent to about 11 years, more than 11 years of global carbon emissions from all sectors. But forests aren't just trees. We think of forests as trees. A lot of the climate change discussions are about trees. But increasingly, we're realizing that tropical forests are storing more carbon when large mammals are present. Most of this is pretty recent research. So there was a paper published in 2016 now, which was the first one, showing basically that large frugivores, such as this spider monkey here, they disperse seeds for large fruited tree species. And those tree species with large fruits tend to have higher wood densities than smaller seeded seeds, and particularly than wind dispersed seeds. So that forests that have their full complement of spider monkeys and tapirs and these other species tend to have up to 5% or more above ground biomass, and hence more carbon than forests without those primates. And as we realize how much we really have to take every chance we can to mitigate climate change, keeping these animals in the forest is really important. This is a more recent paper showing that browsing by African forest elephants leads to fewer larger trees. Loss of forest elephants results in about a 7% decrease in above ground biomass, more in some forests. In some forests, it's potentially modeled to be up to 30%, and hence carbon storage. And so again, if you remember, I said that they'd lost a third of their range and 2/3 of their population in just 10 years. And so that means that those forests are less good at carbon storage. And this one clearly on everybody's minds of recent time is urban wildlife trade. Most of it, a lot of it illegal, poses a high risk of triggering and spreading zoonotic diseases. This is a very typical picture of a market pre-COVID in China, where you have a mass of different species. So you've got snakes and mammals, and you often got chickens and birds and other birds, all sort of stacked up on top of each other in large urban centers close to large numbers of people as well. And that provides the perfect conditions for passing viruses between species, including humans. And we know what catastrophic effects that can have. So that's another reason for controlling these long distance markets, particularly for live animals in that case. So what can we do about it? Basically, to be effective, we have to act all along the trade chain. We have to stop the poaching in the first place. We basically need these animals alive in the forest. So that's the first thing we have to do. The next thing we need to do is stop the trafficking of them. If we can break the trade chain so that animals that are killed can't get out to the markets, then there's no point in killing them, and that'll provide feedback to stop them being killed in the first place. And ultimately, the only way to make this really sustainable is to stop the demand. If people don't want to buy ivory, if they don't want to buy songbirds, then people won't take them from the forest. And so that will stop the killing ultimately, which is of course the ultimate goal. So taking these in turn, just looking quickly through them, stopping the killing, basically this means protection on the ground. It means rangers, forest guards, eco guards, boots on the ground, either in dense swampy forest like this on foot, or else in more open areas in vehicles, or potentially even in from the air, doing good patrols on the ground to deter people and catch people who are potentially doing nefarious things. So this was from that same paper that showed the drastic elephant declines. And in areas where there were eco guards present, had nearly 5 times more elephants than where they were absent. Now, there's been the very sophisticated, really very successful tool developed for helping improve patrols. It's called SMART, which stands for Spatial Monitoring and Reporting Tool. It's a easily accessible online tool. It's free software. It's now available in many languages. There's something like 200 or more protected areas around the world are now using it on a daily basis. And some whole countries, such as Tanzania and Bangladesh and others, have adopted it for all their protected areas. And the way it works is that you have software on a GPS unit. Now, this is also on smartphones. And so rangers go out on patrols, and anytime they see the signs of an animal, or the signs of hunting, such as snares or shotgun cartridges. They record it, and it's automatically geolocated, and that goes into a central database, which is then mapped. So you can then say, okay, these are the real hotspots where the poachers seem to be going in. These are the most important areas for the wildlife. And so you can plan your patrols accordingly. And it has clearly data advantages for efficient patrols. It also has huge advantages in combating the corruption that I talked about, because if a couple of rangers are going out together, partly because they're being geo-tracked, they have to be out on the patrols. They can't be sitting in a local bar making up the data. And secondly, they're going out as a team, they're sharing results. It builds a very high sort of sense of camaraderie and morale boosting. You know, what did you see? And so it's really improving the standard of patrols highly effectively in protected areas all around the world. Here's just one of very many examples. It's a very well documented one. So this site here, it's part of what's called the Western Forest Complex. This complex of 3 wildlife sanctuaries in Western Thailand, near the Myanmar border. It's a hugely important area for tigers, and it's a big area. It's about 6,500 square kilometers, which by Southeast Asian forest standards is huge. And so you've got Hoi Ka Keng here in the east, which was where the tigers were knocked down, and they'd almost been wiped out from the 2 Tung Yai sanctuaries in the west. So over time, this is how patrols basically were expanded over time to cover the whole of that area. And they're now covering almost the whole landscape every year and pretty much every month. And so by 2017, after this had been going for 10 years, this was the amount of patrols that were going on all the time, day in, day out, and that's been maintained right through to the present day. And so what's that done? It's allowed tiger numbers to increase. The picture I showed earlier of the guy shooting the tiger, that was taken in Hoi Ka Keng about 10 years ago. Before that was this where it dipped here. There was about poaching here, but they managed to stop it again all the way up. You can see the overall numbers of tigers is increasing. Mostly in Hoi Ka Keng, where was the real source population, but increasingly to Tung Yai East, which is the reserve immediately next to it, as the tigers are recovering and starting to recolonize the areas further out. And other species are too. Banteng, the big wild cattle, their numbers are increasing. Things like green peafowl, their numbers are increasing. So it's been very effective. So stop the trafficking. Now, I talked about increasing technology for stopping the killing. Stopping the trafficking is kind of going the other way, in the fact that the best technology for stopping trafficking in many areas is dogs. Dogs with their incredibly sensitive noses, and they are very effective at sniffing out any wildlife that they're trained onto, whether it's ivory, whether it's tiger bones, whether it's bushmeat, and they can sniff it inside containers. And so they're increasingly being deployed. It's a very cost-effective way of picking up stuff, particularly if you can pick up a bottleneck in the trade, such as at a port or an airport, or where roads go across a bridge or something like that. And increasingly, we need intelligence networks. This is largely being done by governments. It's their prerogative, but it basically takes a network to beat a network. And so this is getting information from on the ground and from informant networks, and then linking up across different parts of the trade chain to get intelligence going. So those pangolins earlier, they were confiscated in Indonesia, but some of the shipments had already gone through to Vietnam. So they told them in Vietnam, and they caught the next lot going through to there. And so this is basically sort of professionalizing it. To be as good as the traffickers, we've got to employ at least as good a tools as they use. The other thing that we don't often necessarily think about is it's all very fine to catch people, to arrest people, but more often than not in many countries, including sometimes in this one, it gets as far as the judiciary and they say it's wildlife, you know, it's not a really important crime. We're dealing with murders, we're dealing with kidnappings, we're dealing with all this other stuff. We're not going to deal with a few dead animals. And so one of the things that increasingly needs to be done and is being done is to inform and train prosecutors and judges. What are the implications of this trade? What are the costs of this trade? And therefore, why you should take this seriously. And so in Indonesia, for example, where WCS has got what's called a wildlife crimes unit, which works very closely with the government and with the local media to train the judiciary and the prosecutors. And this, you can see now the very high, it goes very well through the legal process. And this is against an Indonesian national background of about 5% of sentencing for things that for arrests made. So it's very high. And interestingly, the media play a really important part of this, again, in terms of the corruption aspect. So say General Suharto is arrested, he can't, if the media is there when he's arrested and it gets into the press, he can't just bribe his way out of it. It will have to go to trial because the media will track it. So it's a really important partnership there. It only happens in countries where there's a free press, which is the case in Indonesia. It's not in a lot of other countries, but where it can be used, it's highly effective. So finally, we want to try and stop the demand. If nobody wants to buy these things, no one's going to shoot animals to get them. This can be done partly by taking legal measures where it's appropriate. Some of these have been done recently, such as in China, because of the health issues, where they're basically closing all live wildlife markets or fresh or meat markets in large urban centers. Now in China, where this is being now implemented, it's done for health reasons. But it also has hugely positive conservation implications as well by removing the market for these species. But we also need to change consumer behavior. We basically want people not to buy this stuff anymore, because if it's just illegal, someone's always going to get their way around the law. But if people don't want to buy it, that's the ultimate success. The big problem is we're not really very good at knowing how to do that. Here was a paper came out in 2018 by Verissimo and One, and what they did was they looked at 236 campaigns, the sorts of things that you'd be familiar with, you know, using celebrities, please don't buy this, please don't do this, or at airports or on televisions, trying to change behavior. And they basically said, and it's a critique of the conservation community, the information on outcomes and impacts was largely anecdotal. It's challenging to know if the demand reduction campaigns are having any basic impact. And conservationists need to adapt much more rigorous impact evaluation practices. So that raised a bit of a red flag, and people are trying to change, but we're still a long way from knowing how to change behavior like that. And we really need to learn from other disciplines, including advertising. You know, buy Coke, not Pepsi. Well, they can be successful at doing that, and we need to learn from it. We do know that we can change as well, certainly at a policy level, at international and national levels, with many partners working together. I talked before about the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species. That's a convention that works by saying, it works by listing species on what's called the appendices. And what it does is it uses science to say this species is threatened by trade, and therefore we will put a control on trade between countries. It's an international trade convention. And CITES, unlike some of the other international conventions, has really got teeth. There are penalties for countries who don't enforce CITES within their own boundaries. And so that can be very effective. The Sustainable Development Goals, Target 15.7 specifically talks about stopping wildlife trafficking, and countries again have to report out on that. It doesn't have the teeth that CITES does, but countries do have to report out on it periodically at the United Nations. So these things can actually be pretty effective in at least changing the environment for wildlife trafficking. Here was a very nice example. It was after all the huge ivory trafficking stuff in the early this century, and it was clear that something needed to be done. So there was lots of political pressure put on in lots of different ways by many different groups. That two of the largest consumers of ivory at that stage were the United States and especially China. But basically just going against China, particularly as Western organizations, is going to have no impact. But going against the US and China and saying you've both got to ban the ivory trade, and leverage off each other. So very successfully in 2015, President Obama and President Xi Jinping both agreed that they would stop their own domestic ivory trades. And both countries have done it. And China has done it as well and is enforcing it. They're being rigorous in enforcing it. It's a bit too soon to say what the impact is going to be, especially with the confounding issue of COVID, which did various different things to ivory markets. Firstly, it rather closed them down because there were no flights coming out of Africa. But then also there was more poaching going on because there was less vigilance on the ground. So it's a bit of a confounding thing, and we don't quite know how it's going to pan out, but we're monitoring it closely, and it's looking pretty optimistic, particularly because all significant importers of ivory now have all closed their domestic ivory markets, the only exception being Japan, and there's strong pressure on Japan to do the same. But we still have a long way to go. Talked about some successes with tigers, successes with ivory and elephants populations in some places are starting to stabilize and recover, but there's other trades which are going the other way. This rather nondescript looking bird has got one of the most fabulous songs in the world. If you Google it afterwards, it's called the straw-headed bulbul, because its head is sort of straw-colored. It lives in Southeast Asia, and it's got this fabulous call duetting between the birds. And songbird trade, particularly in Indonesia, is hugely cultural. They have big songbird competitions. You have songbird trading groups, and it's enormous culturally. And so the straw-headed bulbul, because of that trade and other songbird species, have all really drastically declined. So this species is now critically endangered. It's extinct from most of its range across the whole of Southeast Asia. It used to be really common when I started fieldwork 40 or so years ago. But it's now the only viable population left of this whole species is in Singapore, of all places, because it's very well protected in one reserve there. So, and other songbirds, as this one becomes rarer, the songbird competitions and demand is turning to other species. So it's a rolling trade across songbirds. We have a similar thing with tortoises and turtles. This amazing looking tortoise is called the mata mata. It's in South America. And again, it's being just hammered by the pet trade. And again, the tortoise and turtle trade tends to be a rolling trade across species, so that as one species either becomes too rare to be cost effective to trade, or else it starts to be more effectively protected, then people switch to the next weird looking turtle to start exploiting. Jaguars, we're all very familiar with tiger trade being a big problem for tiger bones. Now tiger numbers are both going down, but also tigers are now being much more effectively protected. The consumers are turning to some of the other big cat species, lions, and more recently jaguars. And it's very hard to tell their bones apart in markets. And so the jaguar trade, we know, is going up in places like Bolivia. And as ivory controls for elephant ivory are becoming much stricter and countries are banning it, then the trade in hippo ivory, these guys, it's not an elephant tusk, but it's pretty carvable and it's pretty big. The demand for hippo ivory is going up. So we are a long way from solving this problem because there's just too many species that people like. I talked about CITES and the fact it's got teeth. The next, CITES has what's called conventions of the parties, and they happen every 3 years, roughly. And that's when all 184 member countries come together with a lot of NGOs who act as technical advisors and lobbyists. And the next one starts in just under 2 weeks in Panama City. And all of those species on the previous slide, they're all up for listing to get greater international protection for them, for the bulbul and the mata mata and hippos. And there's more regulations due to come into place or being proposed to come into place to control jaguar trade. And so basically, there's going to be quite a lot of news on this, a lot around sharks as well, which I didn't talk about today, but to try and control the shark fin trade. And so there's a lot of sharks up for better protection at the next CITES meeting in a couple of weeks. And I am absolutely sure you'll be seeing a lot of this on the news and in social media, because this CITES ones always get a lot of attention. There's always arguments as to whether the ivory trade should be reopened. There's always arguments about what to do about rhino horn. And so that's happening later this month. And so watch this space, because you're going to see it in the news. Thank you very much. And then obviously I'm happy to take any questions. And I will stop sharing my screen.
Thank you so much, Liz. So we do have one question so far in the Q&A, and I would invite people to go ahead and add to that. From Anonymous, we have a question. How do you feel about people who hunt for ego, not to sell or consume?
That's an extremely good question, and it's a very controversial topic, as I'm sure you're aware. What I feel about it and what's scientifically logical are not the same thing. So what I feel about it is I feel it's abhorrent that people will shoot giraffes and elephants and these big, often seemingly sentient, charismatic species for their own pleasure and their own ego. There is a flip side to that. There's quite a lot of stuff published on this, is the fact that across Africa particularly, but in other parts of the world too, quite a lot of land is protected from being cleared for agriculture because it's used for trophy hunting. So if you take Tanzania, for example, something like 4 times the amount of land is protected as game reserves, which is for trophy hunting, than is protected in national parks. And that provides a source of income within that land use. And so if that trophy hunting stopped, then you would lose a huge proportion, more than half, well over half of protected land in Africa, in Tanzania, for conserving lions and elephants and other species. So it's controversial, it's difficult, but on the other hand, it keeps land wild for species which otherwise would undoubtedly turn into agriculture. There's certain other species in Pakistan and Tajikistan and other areas where people pay to hunt some of these, they're called mountain monarchs, these fantastic goats and sheep with huge, great horns. It's one of the only sources of income for some of the rural communities in some of these very remote mountain areas, and it provides them a source of income to keep those animals on the land rather than just all sheep and goats. That keeps snow leopards going. So it's a complicated one, because ethically, I think it's in some ways it's terrible. But until we can find an alternative for those actually in some cases really large areas of land which get their money from safari hunting, we would lose a lot of wildlife if it doesn't happen.
All right, we've got actually several questions are coming in now. We have another one from Anonymous. Did COVID help some populations of animals recover, or did poachers still continue to trap and kill animals?
It's a mixed picture. It's really a mixed picture. And the picture's still not completely clear yet. People are still collecting data. In some ways, I said initially, by closing down all transport systems and by making people stay at home, poaching in some areas decreased. But then at the start of COVID, for some species, we saw an uptick in poaching. What happened in some of the poorer countries, particularly across Africa and Asia, is that as the tourism industry collapsed and as other industries collapsed in urban areas as well, people went back to their villages. They didn't have any choice, and they had to go back to hunting because they'd lost their jobs and they didn't have any choice. So hunting of some species in both large game birds as well as mammals did increase. And the tourists, particularly in Africa, the fact that you've got tourist buses going around some of these national parks all the time deters poachers. So again, poaching did go up a little bit, but it didn't seem to be uncontrollable. And as far as we can tell, it's back under control okay now. And certainly people are realizing, I mean, the Chinese paramount, but others as well, they just have to close some of these wildlife markets. They're just not healthy, and that's great for conservation.
Claire S., what are your thoughts on anti-poaching tactics like dyeing rhinos' horns bright pink?
if they can be made if practical, then lots of things are worth trying. One of the problems is practicality, because you're dealing with populations of wild animals scattered over huge areas. So a lot of these things in practice aren't very practical. But for some of these species, if there's solutions that are practical, bearing in mind you're dealing with wild animals in the wild, then they can be worth a try.
Another anonymous question. Do you think zoos have been doing well in conserving endangered species? And what do you think they could do better?
Firstly, there's zoos and there's zoos. So within this country, you've got the zoos that are accredited by AZA, the Association of Zoos and Aquariums, which has very high standards, and zoos have to be certified to maintain those standards. And so they can perform an incredibly good job in educating the public. Some zoos, I mean, Wildlife Conservation Society, modestly, the most of any zoo in this country, more than 50% of our total money is spent on conservation in the wild. And that's many millions of dollars a year. So, and San Diego Zoo, various other zoos also have very large field conservation programs. So some zoos can do a fabulous job at field conservation. Zoological Society of London is another one. Some of the big European zoos do. And those zoos, particularly the ones that are certified, they're not sourcing their large mammals, their endangered species from the wild anymore. They're from captive collections. And so they can do a very good job. Other zoos in other parts of the world are, in all honesty, fronts for wildlife trade. And they, so, you know, the pheasants that you see in that cage today might be different ones that are there tomorrow because they're being sold. So, and they're not necessarily certified, and they can be fronts for wildlife trade. So certainly they could be doing a lot more by just becoming legal and honest. Otherwise, in terms of zoos here, AZA is trying to encourage zoos in this country to spend at least 3% of their budget on conservation in the wild. I say we spend more than 100% of ours, but some small local zoos can't. But they can certainly spend more, but they also can do, and a lot do, but local conservation programs within their local wildlife areas, collaborating with local natural history groups, that sort of thing as well.
I think they can do a lot better than 3% too. It was always a big fight that I always had with my institution, that I always said we should be at least doing a minimum of 5%, and that's really not asking a whole lot from a zoo. So if you belong to a zoo organization, any of you, make your voice heard. Keep on saying that to the directors. They need to be spending more in the wild. Sorry, I had to put my 2 cents in there.
Oh, absolutely, you're absolutely right. I mean, the reason it's set as low as 3% is for some of these small zoos that are founded by basically their local government, but they could still raise private monies for it. I mean, most of the money we spend on our conservation programs doesn't come from New York City. It comes from private donors that the zoo attracts, and all zoos could do that. I completely agree.
Claire asks, it seems a lot of the demand is cultural, for religious significance or for perceived spiritual and medicinal properties. How can we change people's culture to not butcher animals, especially in more rural and remote places?
That's a very interesting one. I mean, there's the rural and remote places is somewhat more complicated, because I said a lot of rural remote people actually depend on it because they're their only source of protein. If you're in a remote tropical forest area, domestic animals don't do well in those habitats, and you really don't have a lot of choice, but that needs to be kept to sustainable levels, to species that can stand the pressure while trying to build up other sources of protein. In terms of the belief for medicinal purposes, you're right. That's a real problem. And in some ways, it's more difficult to tackle than the ivory problem, because if you genuinely believe that the only thing that's going to save your son from dying from cancer is taking rhino horn, if you really believe that, it's very hard to say to someone, no, you've got to let your son die. So that's a tough one. But on the whole, yeah, it is something we need to be thinking much more about how to deal with. As populations get more educated, then younger people, certainly in China, a lot of the traditional medicine in China tends to be amongst the older population, but not entirely. And yes, it's a difficult challenge. It's a really difficult challenge. And learning more about behavioral techniques to change people's attitudes is clearly something the conservation community needs to do a better job of, but it's a challenging one.
We have a question from Ben. Is there evidence for the effectiveness of conservation efforts for charismatic megafauna, like elephants and tigers, that also improve the conservation initiatives of less frequently advertised species that share the same habitats? For instance, the efforts to save African elephants also boost the wild populations of other savanna species.
Yeah, very good question, Ben. And the answer is, as far as we know, absolutely yes. So one of the reasons that organizations, a lot of conservation organizations, focus on these big charismatic species that range over huge areas, elephants, big cats, is because in theory, if you're saving them, then you save everything else. So if you're saving tigers, and if you've got all your smart patrols out there to save tigers, then you're automatically saving tiger prey, because you can't have tigers without tiger prey. You're saving tiger habitat, and that means you're saving clouded leopards, you're saving all the bird species in there as well. So unless there's a specific threat targeted to another species within it, the assumption is, yes, if we're protecting these big charismatic things, then yes, we're protecting an awful lot of other things as well.
And Anonymous asks, is the ivory trade the largest sector of wildlife trafficking? And how does the animal skins trade compare?
It's a good question. It depends whether you talk by volume or number of animals or value. And what's widely quoted as the most trafficked mammal is the pangolin. Do you know what a pangolin looks like? I can try and pull up a picture of one if you give me a second. And so there's 8 species of pangolins across Africa and Asia, and they are really very heavily traded. I showed you pictures of ones in a freezer, but that doesn't necessarily mean you know what they look like in real life. They're traded for their meat and their scales, and both of those are for largely medicinal purposes. And I cannot find a shot. Sorry, I'm not going to be able to find it, but just Google pangolin. And they all look pretty similar. And so that, in terms of just sheer numbers of animals, is supposed to be the most traded. In terms of value of trade, not now, because so much of it's been closed down, but it probably was the ivory trade. But in terms of volumes, some of the smaller species are also traded in pretty large volumes.
Liz, since you brought up pangolins, and pangolins have certainly been a species that I've worked with in my zoo career, and also very much interested in within the trade within Liberia. I've always felt that this is one of those groups of animals that, trying to address the trafficking in pangolins in a country like Liberia that isn't yet fully engaged in the Asian trade, but we see a rising amount of pangolins now being transported from Africa to Asian markets. What's the best way of trying to promote awareness that pangolins are of great concern without encouraging more people to get involved in the trade when they find out how valuable they are and how big the demand is in another part of the world?
Yeah, that's a very good question. In fact, for Liberia, you could answer that question a lot better than I can, I'm absolutely sure. I mean, one of the things at the at a previous CITES meeting, we did manage to get, well, I mean, huge collective global community, all pangolins listed on CITES Appendix 1, which means that all international trade, that's the strictest CITES listing, so all international trade in pangolins is now illegal. So that at least provides a basis for enforcement action. But in terms of changing people's behavior, it's a different one. I mean, I don't know what your answer to that one would be. I say you would probably know what works in Liberia a lot better than I do.
Well, actually, it's a question that I've been pondering for quite some time. As I don't know if you remember, Liz, but after I left the Philly Zoo, I started my own little conservation organization, and we
Yes,
worked
I
on
do.
bushmeat issues in Liberia. And I still have some funds in that group, and we have provided support for a student in Liberia to continue doing some surveys in bushmeat markets, and particularly focusing on pangolins. And what we found that during COVID, we were still seeing the local trafficking of live animals. And for the first time, I had never seen much in the way of smoked pangolins, but they were starting to show up in the market, which indicated that they're being transported a lot further than what they had been in the past. And that it was reported that those traders were hoarding scales, particularly along the border with Guinea, and that COVID had stopped them from transporting those scales across, but clearly there was a market for them. And so that concerns me, that, we've been seeing increased trade from Nigeria. My belief is that we're probably going to see a continued growth in that trade. And really, I don't have the answer to this either, Liz. I am very concerned that, the moment you start trying to promote pangolins as being a species of great concern, and anyone gets wind that, the value of a single pangolin may be worth 50 to 100 times what it is in the local market, for international purposes, whether we'll just, greatly increase the actual harvest rate while they are harvested on and if they come across a pangolin, they're harvesting it because it's so valued for its meat. It's valued for, in some of the cultures, for medicinal or spiritual kinds of things. But there are some cultures in West Africa that also ban any kind of hunting of pangolins. They're considered a sacred animal.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, I mean, it's one of the things where we generally never broadcast the value of some of these species. Other organizations sometimes do. We don't, for exactly that reason. But also it depends, value, well, where, to the guy that's hunted it or to the guy that's selling it in a market in China. And they're very different. And you actually don't really want to publicize the latter.
Sure. And I think we're pretty close to the end of our time, but I wanted to step back a little bit to the bigger picture again. You were bringing up the Sustainable Development Goals and the discussions that will be taking place with CITES. And you also brought up the fact that, trafficking is often related to drug and gun running as well. Have you seen over the years an increased sophistication in the kinds of trafficking that are taking place? We've been involved with the war on drugs, and we're still in a big war on the amount of guns that are being trafficked around the world. Are they coming up with new schemes that we're having a hard time beating?
In terms of the wildlife trade, probably not hugely. I mean, once you've got the organized crime work, certainly in recent years, it probably hasn't got that much more sophisticated, I would think. I mean, if you've got a huge crate of, I mean, one of the things about wildlife as opposed to drugs is it's kind of bulky a lot of the time. Yeah. And so you've got to, if you're going to transport it in bulk, you've got to have a container or something to do it. And there's a limit to how sophisticated you can be with that.
Right. And related to the Sustainable Development Goals, I think I was really pleased to see that the wildlife and environmental elements started becoming more and more prominent within the Sustainable Development Goals. From your work, do you see governments taking these components as seriously as they do maybe some of the other components of the goals?
Yes, some governments definitely do. There's a coalition within the UN, co-chaired by Germany and Gabon, called Friends of Wildlife, and they've now passed 4 or 5 resolutions on wildlife trafficking through the UN since the Sustainable Development Goals came through, picking up on target 15.7, and they have all been adopted unanimously by all countries in the UN, including countries like China and Vietnam. So there clearly is strong support for some of these measures, partly because people are seeing the links with security, they're seeing the links with corruption. And so, yes, they are getting quite a lot of support within some of these big processes, which is great.
Great. Well, Liz, it has been such a pleasure to see your face again, and haven't had anywhere near enough time for us to chat, but I have thoroughly enjoyed your presentation. Just by the number of questions we got, I think that our audience enjoyed it very much as well. Thank you so much for taking your time to speak with our group. Wish you the best, and I hope it isn't so many years before I see your face again.
Thank you so very much. I completely agree. And as we said before we started, we're not actually that far apart. So let's so thank you very, very much. It's such a pleasure. And thank you very much indeed to everybody who joined in and who posed such great questions.
I will definitely be giving you a holler when our zoo group is headed up to the Bronx again. Maybe we can have a lunch together or something.
That would be great. Thank you very much indeed. That would be fabulous.
Have a great night, Liz, and a good night to everybody else.
Thanks to everybody.
Thank you.